Seattle, 2008. If someone had asked me, back then, to describe my life, I would have said it was the kind people dream about. Maddie and I were the definition of a power couple. I was leading a critical urban development project in Tacoma, one that promised to reshape the city's waterfront into a vibrant commercial hub. Maddie, on the other hand, was one of Seattle's top real estate brokers, closing deals on multi-million-dollar properties like it was second nature. Our evenings were filled with wine-soaked celebrations of success, our weekends with trips to the San Juan Islands, and our mornings, when our schedules aligned, with shared coffee over the soft hum of NPR. Life was seamless, or so it seemed. The first crack appeared during a party at Maddie's firm, an opulent affair held in the glass-walled banquet room of a downtown skyscraper. The view stretched endlessly over the glimmering lights of the city below, but my attention wasn't on the scenery. It was on Maddie. She thrived in these settings, her laughter infectious, her confidence magnetic. Watching her, I often thought she was too good to be true. I was nursing a second glass of scotch when I first heard his voice, Dylan. Maddie had introduced us earlier that evening. He was one of those effortlessly charming types, the kind who made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Maddie had called him a financial genius, and he certainly played the part. Crisp tailored suit, a gold watch that gleamed just enough to catch your eye, but not enough to scream ostentation, and a smile that lingered longer than it should. From across the room, I saw Maddie and Dylan locked in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Curious, I drifted closer, staying just out of view, but within earshot. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Maddie," Dylan was saying, his voice smooth as honey. "Rural Idaho is the next big frontier. Development there is going to explode, and the land values will skyrocket. We could get in ahead of the curve." Maddie tilted her head, a gesture I knew well. It meant she wasn't entirely convinced. "It sounds promising, but I don't make recommendations to my clients without doing thorough research. If I wouldn't put my own money into it, I can't in good conscience suggest it to anyone else." "That's what makes you so good at what you do," Dylan replied, flashing her that disarming smile. "But trust me, Maddie, I've done the legwork. This is solid. Besides, I wouldn't steer you wrong. Not when we've got such great synergy." Synergy? The word lingered in my mind as I stepped away. I didn't want to interrupt, and frankly, I didn't know enough about the real estate market to weigh in. But something about the exchange left a bitter taste in my mouth. Later that night, as we drove home, Maddie brought it up. "What did you think of Dylan?" she asked casually, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He seems confident," I said carefully. She chuckled. "That's one way to put it. He's got a big idea about investing in some properties out in Idaho. Says it could triple in value within a few years." "Ich glänze to hear. And what do you think?" Her fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. "I don't know yet. It's risky, but the returns could be significant. He suggested we consider investing ourselves. With your savings and my bonuses, we could probably swing it." There was the first seed planted. "Let's talk about it after you've done your research," I said, trying to sound supportive while masking my unease. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and meetings. Maddie began spending more late nights at the office, often mentioning Dylan in passing. "Dylan says this," or "Dylan thinks that." It was subtle, but I couldn't ignore the frequency. One evening, as I walked into the kitchen, Maddie was on the phone. She didn't see me enter, and I couldn't help but catch snippets of the conversation. "I don't know, Dylan. It's a lot to consider. Nate's not exactly a gambler when it comes to finances." Her tone was lighter, almost playful. "Well, you're very persuasive. I'll give you that." She ended the call when she noticed me, smiling brightly. "Hey, how was your day?" "Busy," I replied, feigning nonchalance. "Who was that?" "Just Dylan. We're working on a pitch for a big client. He's intense, but he knows his stuff." "Intense, huh?" I said, pouring myself a drink. "Don't read into it," she said, her tone breezy. "He's just passionate about what he does." The real turning point came 2 weeks later when Maddie returned home late, carrying an elegantly wrapped box. "What's this?" I asked as she placed it on the counter. "Dylan gave it to me," she said, her voice casual. "It's a thank you gift for helping him land the Avery account." Inside was a sleek Mont Blanc pen, the kind that screamed wealth and sophistication. Maddie brushed it off as a token of appreciation, but my instincts told me it was something more. I didn't say anything then. Not yet. But the cracks in our perfect life were widening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Dylan was driving the wedge deeper. The morning after Maddie unwrapped the Mont Blanc pen, she was already out the door before I finished my first cup of coffee. Her phone call schedule had doubled overnight, and working late was becoming more of a norm than an exception. Maddie wasn't one to neglect her responsibilities, so I chalked it up to her ambition. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping through my fingers. I drove to the Tacoma Project site that day, a sprawling expanse of soon-to-be revitalized waterfront property. A tangle of cranes and construction vehicles hummed with energy, but I found my focus waning. Maddie's enthusiasm for Dylan's Idaho project lingered in my thoughts. By noon, Jenna intercepted me in the middle of marking up a blueprint. "Nate, you've been staring at that for 5 minutes. What's up?" she asked, her tone part teasing, part concerned. "Just juggling a lot." I waved her off, but Jenna had worked with me long enough to know when I wasn't being forthcoming. "Does this have anything to do with your wife's charming new friend?" She leaned against my desk, arms crossed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jenna shrugged. "Nothing much, just that word travels fast in this city. Dylan Harper isn't exactly an unknown. He's been around. Deals fall apart. People lose money. And more than a few women find themselves entangled in his, let's call it, charisma." Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit, but I wasn't ready to take them seriously. Maddie can handle herself. She's too smart to get swept up in any nonsense. "I hope you're right," Jenna said, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Just keep an eye out. People like Dylan have a way of turning even the sharpest knives dull." That evening, Maddie surprised me with takeout from our favorite Thai place. It was a rare moment of normalcy, and I clung to it. Over dinner, she brought up Dylan's Idaho venture again. "So, I've been thinking," she began, balancing a forkful of noodles. "Dylan's project, it's not just about buying land. It's about developing it strategically. We'd own a share of the trust, meaning any profits from sales or leases come directly to us." "And how much would this share cost?" I asked, already dreading the answer. $300,000. She said it as casually as if she were suggesting we buy a new sofa. I put down my fork. "Maddie, that's nearly everything we've saved. Are you sure this is worth the risk?" "Of course I'm sure," she said, her voice steady but insistent. "I've gone over the numbers. Dylan's plan is airtight. The land is undervalued, but once the infrastructure improves, the appreciation will be massive. We're talking triple returns in just a few years." It was the kind of pitch I'd heard countless times from developers. Still, Maddie's confidence was hard to argue with. "Let me think about it," I said, knowing full well that Maddie's version of thinking about it meant she'd already decided. A week later, we transferred the money. Maddie assured me it was locked into a joint account for the real estate trust, but something about the whole arrangement nagged at me. I pushed the doubts aside. Maddie hadn't steered us wrong before, and I had no reason to suspect she'd start now. The cracks deepened slowly. Maddie's late nights at the office became later. She stopped leaving her phone lying around, a habit I hadn't even noticed until it changed. Small things, like her perfume lingering longer than usual when she came home, began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Jenna's warning replayed itself over and over, but I buried it beneath the noise of my work. Until one evening, when Jenna knocked on the door of my office after hours. "You got a minute?" she asked, stepping in before I could answer. "What's up?" Jenna dropped a file onto my desk. "I thought you'd want to see this." Inside were printed articles and legal notices, all tied to Dylan. A failed real estate deal in Bellevue. A lawsuit from an investor claiming mismanagement of funds. A whispered accusation of an affair that had complicated another business partnership. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my throat tightening. "It's public record if you know where to look. I'm not saying this proves anything, but if Maddie's tied up with him financially, you should be careful." I sat back, the weight of it pressing down on me. "Thanks, Jenna. Be smart, Nate," she said, her voice softer now. "You've got a lot to lose." The storm came 2 days later. I walked into the kitchen to find Maddie staring at her laptop, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my briefcase. She turned the screen toward me. An email was open, the The subject line stark against the white background. Your husband's betrayal. Below, a string of photos told a damning story. Me and Jenna at a restaurant, laughing, leaning close. Another of me leaving a hotel with a blonde woman I didn't recognize. What the hell is this? I asked, my voice sharp with disbelief. I was hoping you could tell me, Maddie said, her tone icy. Maddie, this is insane. These photos, they're not real. I don't even know that woman. Oh, so Jenna isn't the only one? Her words cut deep, but there was something behind her anger. Something darker, like a script she'd been handed and was playing out reluctantly. Maddie, listen to me. Someone's trying to manipulate you. Jenna and our relationship is professional, nothing more. And this other woman? I have no idea who she is. She stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I need time to think. That night, Maddie slept in the guest room. I stayed up, pacing the living room, replaying every interaction with Jenna, every warning she'd given me. Dylan's face loomed in my thoughts, his charm now tinged with menace. By morning, the foundation of my marriage felt dangerously close to collapse, and I knew I had to dig deeper before everything crumbled. Maddie cornered me the next morning, her laptop perched on the edge of the kitchen counter, as if it were a judge about to deliver a verdict. I had barely poured myself a cup of coffee when she hit me with it. We need to talk, she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. I set the mug down and leaned against the counter. I figured as much. Maddie gestured toward the open laptop, the incriminating email still glaring on the screen. You said last night these pictures were fake. Do you have any proof of that? Her question caught me off guard. Proof? How does someone prove they didn't do something? Maddie, you know me. I don't even know who that woman is, and Jenna, she interrupted, her voice rising. You spend more time talking to her than you do to me. Late calls, private meetings. How do you expect me to believe there's nothing going on? She's my colleague, I said firmly. We work together. Those late calls? They're about the Tacoma project. Maddie, not clandestine rendezvous. You know that. She folded her arms and stared me down, as if trying to determine whether my words were genuine or carefully rehearsed. What about the hotel? She demanded, her eyes narrowing. What hotel? She pointed at the screen. This one, Nate. You're walking out of a hotel with a blonde. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I have no idea who that woman is or where that photo was taken. It's not me, Maddie. Someone's messing with us. Messing with us? She scoffed. Why would anyone go to the trouble of faking photos like this? You think someone has it out for you? I don't know, I admitted. But think about it. Doesn't this feel too convenient? These pictures show up right when we've just made a massive financial investment. Her expression faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. Don't try to deflect this onto the investment, Nate. This is about trust. And you don't trust me, I said, the weight of those words hanging heavy in the air. Maddie looked away, her jaw tightening. I don't know what to think anymore. The tension lingered like a dark cloud over our house for days. Maddie avoided me when she could, throwing herself into work and, presumably, Dylan's orbit. For my part, I buried myself in the Tacoma project, but no matter how many blueprints I pored over or meetings I attended, my mind kept circling back to her words. I don't know what to think anymore. It was around this time that I was asked to take on a new project in Spokane, a multi-phase urban renewal initiative that required extensive planning and on-site coordination. The work was a welcome distraction, but it also meant spending 3 nights a week out of town. When I broke the news to Maddie over dinner, she barely looked up from her plate. That's fine, she said, her tone devoid of emotion. Phoenix? I asked, prodding for more. She shrugged. It's not like we've been seeing much of each other lately anyway. I wanted to argue, to tell her how much I hated the distance growing between us, but something in her demeanor stopped me. Instead, I nodded and returned to my meal, the silence between us deafening. The first few weeks in Spokane were uneventful. My days were filled with site inspections and meetings, my nights spent in a small rental apartment that felt more like a prison cell than a temporary home. Maddie and I kept in touch through sporadic phone calls, but they were short and strained, each conversation a minefield of unspoken grievances. It wasn't until I returned home one weekend that I noticed the first clue. The house felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense that something was out of place. It wasn't until I stepped into the bedroom that it hit me. The pillows on our bed were arranged differently, the way Maddie never liked them. A faint scent hung in the air, something musky and unfamiliar. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting my suspicions cloud my judgment. But then there was the cufflink. I found it on the floor near the nightstand, a sleek silver piece that certainly wasn't mine. Maddie was in the shower at the time, and I stood there staring at it, my mind racing. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel, I held it up. "What's this?" Her eyes widened for the briefest of moments before she recovered. "Oh, that. It's probably one of Dylan's. He stopped by the other day to drop off some paperwork, and he must have lost it." "In our bedroom?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't know," she said with a shrug. "Maybe it got caught on his jacket or something." Her explanation felt flimsy, but I let it slide for now. The following weekend, the pattern repeated. More misplaced items, more faint traces of cologne that wasn't mine. A wine glass left in the sink when Maddie hadn't mentioned having anyone over. It all came to a head on a Sunday night. I had come home early from Spokane, hoping to surprise Maddie, only to find her in the living room with Dylan. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but the atmosphere was unmistakably intimate. Maddie's laugh, soft and melodic, filled the room as Dylan leaned in, his smile just a little too smug. "Nate," Maddie said, her voice laced with forced cheer. "You're home early." "Clearly," I replied, my gaze shifting between the two of them. "What's going on?" "Dylan was just helping me go over some figures for the Idaho project," she said quickly. "Figures," I repeated, my skepticism evident. Dylan stood, smoothing his suit as if to assert dominance. "I should be going," he said, his tone annoyingly polite. "Maddie, I'll email you those updates tomorrow." I didn't respond as he walked past me, but the tension between us crackled like a live wire. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Maddie. "How often is he here when I'm not around?" "Don't start," she said, her expression hardening. "Maddie, this isn't just about me. People are noticing." Jenna mentioned. "Jenna," Maddie spat, cutting me off. "Of course. Your dear friend Jenna. Funny how you're so quick to question me, but not her." "This isn't about Jenna," I shouted, the frustration boiling over. "It's about you. It's about us. Do you even care anymore?" Her silence was all the answer I needed. That night, as Maddie slept in the guest room once again, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the cufflinks still sitting on the counter. The cracks in our foundation were no longer subtle. They were gaping, threatening to bring the whole structure crashing down. And I had a sinking feeling that Dylan was standing at the epicenter, ready to blow it all apart. The last time I drove back from Spokane unannounced, it was to surprise Maddie with dinner reservations at a restaurant she loved. This time, there were no such romantic intentions. My gut told me something was wrong, very wrong, and I had learned to trust that instinct. The house was dark when I arrived, the driveway empty except for Maddie's car. I parked down the street, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment, the tension thrumming in my chest like a war drum. If Maddie was alone, I'd confront her about everything. If she wasn't, I let myself in quietly, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound in the stillness. I had no plan, just the weight of suspicion propelling me forward. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard voices, low and urgent, coming from the living room. I crept closer, careful to stay out of sight. Maddie's voice was unmistakable. "He won't suspect anything. Nate trusts me, even now. He's too preoccupied with work to notice." A second voice, smooth and confident, followed hers. "Dylan, he's an easy mark, Maddie. The LLC is already set up in his name. When the audits come back, it'll look like he funneled the money out himself. The divorce court will eat it up." I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was hearing. "The LLC? Audits?" Maddie laughed, a sound that felt foreign and sharp. "He won't know what hit him. By the time he figures it out, I'll have the house, the cars, and the settlement. And you and I can finally be together," Dylan finished, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I leaned back against the wall, my breath coming in shallow bursts. They weren't just conspiring against me. They were planning to ruin me, to strip away everything I had worked for. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I pressed record. I couldn't risk confronting them now, not without evidence. The conversation moved to lighter topics, their laughter grating in my ears. When they started discussing dinner plans, I slipped out the back door, my heart pounding. In the safety of my car, I replayed the recording. It wasn't as clear as I'd hoped, but it was enough to prove Maddie and Dylan were colluding against me. I didn't have all the details yet, but one thing was certain: I needed to act fast. The next morning, I called Jenna. "Jenna, I need a favor," I said, keeping my voice low as I sat in my car outside a coffee shop. "Name it," she replied without hesitation. "Do you know anyone who can pull financial records? I think Maddie's tied up in something shady, and I need to figure out what's going on before it's too late." Jenna didn't ask for specifics, which I appreciated. "I'll make a few calls. Sit tight." That evening, I combed through Maddie's home office. I knew it was risky. If she caught me, I'd have no excuse, but I couldn't sit idly by. In the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found an envelope marked policy. Inside was a life insurance document, the ink still fresh on the amendment. Maddie was listed as the sole beneficiary, and the payout was staggering: $2 million. My breath caught in my throat. Maddie's confidence in their conversation with Dylan suddenly made sense. She wasn't just planning to take everything in a divorce. She was hedging her bets in case something more permanent happened to me. I needed more, something to confirm my worst fears. I searched the room for any hidden stash of files or devices and finally found it: a cheap burner phone tucked into the bottom of a decorative box. The screen lit up as I powered it on, the lock screen password-free. The messages made my stomach churn. Explicit text between Maddie and Dylan filled the thread, accompanied by photos I couldn't unsee. But it was one message, buried among the others, that stopped me cold. The final step is in place. Once it's done, we're free. No more looking over our shoulders. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The final step. What did that mean? A notification popped up, breaking my trance. It was a new message from Dylan. "Call me when he's out of town. We'll go over the timeline." I spent the next hour documenting everything: the text, the photos, the insurance policy. When I finally collapsed onto the guest room bed, exhaustion weighed heavy on me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing that the woman I had built my life with was plotting to tear it apart? Or worse. By morning, I had a plan. I couldn't confront Maddie yet, not without understanding the full scope of their scheme. But I wasn't going to let her or Dylan destroy me without a fight. I drove back to Spokane, the burner phone hidden safely in my bag. Every mile felt like a countdown to whatever final step they had planned. The invitation was unexpected. Maddie approached me one evening, her demeanor surprisingly cheerful considering the tension that had hung between us for weeks. "I thought we should have a little dinner party," she said casually, flipping through a recipe book at the kitchen counter. "Just us, Dylan, and a couple of my colleagues. Something low-key, you know? It's been a while since we entertained." The idea caught me off guard. Maddie's enthusiasm for hosting had waned over the years, and the timing felt off. But I nodded, careful to mask my suspicion. "Sounds good," I replied. "Let me know if you need me to pick up anything." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be here on time for once." The day of the dinner party arrived, and I returned home early from Spokane, ensuring I had time to prepare. Maddie was already in full hostess mode, arranging a platter of hors d'oeuvres while a pot simmered on the stove. "Everything smells amazing," I said, testing the waters. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Dylan's bringing the wine. Try not to drink too much before dinner." I nodded, retreating to the bedroom. There, I slipped the burner phone out of its hiding spot and scrolled through the messages again. The most recent one from Dylan still burned in my mind. "Tonight's the night. Just keep him distracted, and I'll handle the rest." Tonight's the night. The words echoed in my head as I tucked the phone back into its hiding place. Whatever they had planned, it was happening here in my own home. Guests began arriving around 7. Maddie's colleagues, Julia and Eric, were the first to show up, followed shortly by Dylan, who swept in with a bottle of red wine and his signature charm. "Nate," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good to see you, buddy." "Likewise," I replied, forcing a smile. The evening unfolded smoothly, or so it seemed. Maddie flitted between the kitchen and the living room, ensuring everyone's glasses stayed full, while Dylan entertained the group with stories of his latest ventures. "Idaho's going to be the next big thing," he was saying as I refilled my glass. "People think I'm crazy now, but just wait a few years. They'll see." I caught Maddie watching him with a look that was equal parts admiration and something darker. Lust? Greed? Whatever it was, it made my stomach turn. Dinner was served promptly at 8. Maddie had outdone herself with the meal. A roast chicken surrounded by perfectly roasted vegetables, paired with the wine Dylan had brought. The conversation was light and breezy, though I noticed Maddie kept glancing at my glass. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, taking a sip of water instead of the wine. "Of course," she said, her smile tight. "I'm just glad you're here. It feels like we haven't had a night like this in ages." Her words rang hollow, but I played along, raising my glass in a toast. "To good food and good company. To new beginnings," Dylan added, his gaze lingering on Maddie. As the evening wore on, Maddie poured me another glass of wine, insisting I try it. I watched her carefully as she poured, her hands steady, her expression calm. But I knew what was in that glass. When she wasn't looking, I swapped it with Dylan's. It happened halfway through dessert. Dylan lifted his glass, draining it in one smooth motion before suddenly coughing. "Dylan," Maddie's voice wavered, her fork clattering against her plate. He tried to speak, but his words came out garbled, his face turning an alarming shade of red. Seconds later, he collapsed to the floor, convulsing. Julia screamed. Eric jumped to his feet, and Maddie froze, her eyes wide with horror. "What's happening?" I asked, feigning ignorance as I knelt beside Dylan. Maddie's gaze snapped to me, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" "Me?" I shot back. "What are you talking about?" "You switched the glasses, didn't you?" she hissed, her composure cracking. "Why would I do that?" I said, keeping my tone even. "Unless there's something in this glass that shouldn't be there." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of Julia's panicked voice cut her off. "Someone needs to call 911. I stepped back, letting Julia take charge. Dylan's convulsions had stopped, his body lying unnaturally still. He's gone to the other side of the world. The guests left shortly after, shaken and confused. Maddie and I were alone in the kitchen, the silence between us suffocating. "You killed him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed, a bitter sound that made her flinch. "Killed him? Maddie, you and Dylan poisoned that wine. You just didn't expect him to drink it." Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't buying the act. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, stepping closer. "You were going to kill me tonight, weren't you? Just like you and Dylan planned. And then you'd walk away with everything, our savings, the house, the settlement." She shook her head vehemently. "It wasn't like that. Save it." I snapped, my patience wearing thin. Later that night, I searched Dylan's car, parked at the end of our driveway. I found it tucked beneath the passenger seat, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. It was all there: the affair, the LLC, the insurance policy, and the final step, the plan to poison me, bury my body on a plot of land in Coeur d'Alene, and make it look like I'd disappeared under suspicious circumstances. I sat in the driver's seat, the journal heavy in my hands, as the weight of everything came crashing down. Maddie hadn't just betrayed me. She had conspired to end me. But Dylan was gone. And Maddie? Maddie still had to answer for her sins. The morning after Dylan's untimely demise, the house was unervingly quiet. Maddie hadn't come to bed. Not that I expected her to. She was likely pacing the living room, rehearsing excuses, or maybe even plotting her next move. I had spent the night poring over Dylan's journal, committing every damning detail to memory. By sunrise, I was ready to confront her. I found Maddie sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. Her eyes were puffy, her hair disheveled. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of exhaustion and wariness. "We need to talk," I said, setting the journal down on the table between us. "What is that?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Dylan's journal," I replied. "Everything he was planning. Everything you were planning." Her face went pale. "Nate, save it," I interrupted. "I've read enough to know exactly what was going on. The affair, the LLC, the life insurance, the poison wine. It's all in here." She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to silence her. "You're going to tell me the truth, Maddie. All of it. And just so we're clear," I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, showing her the recording app. "This conversation is being recorded." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might try to bolt. Instead, she slumped back in her chair, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It started with the Idaho Project," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dylan was so persuasive. He made it sound like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And when you were skeptical, he told me we could handle it ourselves, that we didn't need you." "And the affair?" I prompted, keeping my tone steady. Her gaze dropped to the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen. At first, it was just business. But then he started saying things about how you were always gone, how you didn't appreciate me." I was angry, Nate. Angry and stupid. I resisted the urge to lash out, instead letting her continue. "When he suggested the LLC, I thought it was just a way to protect the investment. I didn't realize until later that he was using it to frame you." "And the poison?" I asked, leaning forward. "Was that your idea or his?" Tears streamed down her face now. "His. He said it was the only way, that you'd never agree to a divorce and that we'd lose everything in court. I didn't want to go through with it, Nate, I swear. But Dylan, he had this way of twisting things, making it seem like there was no other choice." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on both of us. "Do you know what the worst part is, Maddie?" I said finally. "I would have given you the world if you just asked for it." Over the next hour, I laid out my terms. Maddie would transfer all assets from the LLC back into my name. She would relinquish her claim to our joint accounts and sign over the house. In return, I wouldn't take the recording or the journal to the police. She agreed, her voice hollow as she said, "I'll do whatever you want, Nate. Just don't ruin me." "It's a little late for that," I muttered, picking up the journal and heading for the door. Later that afternoon, I made a call to Jenna. "I need a recommendation," I said. "Someone discreet, a private investigator." Jenna didn't ask questions, though her tone betrayed her concern. "I know a guy. I'll text you his info." The investigator, a man named Carl, met me at a diner on the outskirts of town. He was in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "What's the job?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. "I need to know if Maddie had other accomplices, or if Dylan was hiding anything I haven't already uncovered." Carl nodded, jotting down notes. "Got it. Anything specific you want me to focus on?" I slid a photocopy of a page from Dylan's journal across the table. "There's a mention of an offshore account in Bermuda. I need to know if it's real, and if so, how much is in it." Carl glanced at the page, then back at me. "This could take some time. Offshore accounts aren't easy to trace." "I don't care how long it takes," I said. "Just find me the truth." While Carl began his investigation, I started untangling the financial web Dylan and Maddie had woven. The LLC was a mess of forged documents and fabricated transactions. But one thing was clear. Dylan had been siphoning money into accounts I hadn't known existed. One evening, as I was sorting through yet another stack of papers, Carl called. "I've got something," he said, his voice steady. "The Bermuda account is real. It's registered under an alias, David Harris, but the funds trace back to Dylan." "How much is in it?" I asked, holding my breath. "Just over $1 million. $1 million. I let out a low whistle. "Can you access it?" "Not without more documentation," Carl admitted. "But if you have Dylan's journal, it might contain the key." That night, I pored over the journal again, my fingers tracing the neat handwriting as I searched for clues. Toward the back, I found it, a series of numbers scribbled in the margins next to the name Harris. I stared at the numbers, a plan forming in my mind. Maddie and Dylan had tried to destroy me, but now I held all the cards. The ink on Maddie's agreement was barely dry when I took the first steps toward dismantling the LLC. Dylan's labyrinthine accounts were complex, but with Carl's help and the detailed notes in the journal, I traced every last dollar back to its source. It was grueling work, but by the end of the month, the LLC was no more. The offshore account in Bermuda posed a more delicate challenge. The numbers in Dylan's journal unlocked access to the funds, but I knew better than to transfer the money directly into my name. Instead, I set up a new business entity, clean, legitimate, and unconnected to the LLC, and funneled the money there. With those funds, I launched my own urban planning firm. It was the clean slate I needed, a way to rebuild what Maddie and Dylan had tried to destroy. Maddie, meanwhile, kept her head down. She moved into a small apartment across town and agreed to a no-contest divorce. As part of our arrangement, she surrendered all claims to the house, the accounts, and the business. Our final conversation was brief and to the point. "Do you hate me?" she asked, her voice soft. "I don't have time for hate, Maddie," I replied. "I'm too busy moving on." And with that, I closed the door on that chapter of my life. Moving on, however, proved more complicated than I'd anticipated. Jenna had been a constant presence throughout the ordeal, offering advice, support, and a much-needed dose of humor when things felt overwhelming. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I invited her over for dinner. "I didn't know you could cook," she teased as I set a plate of pasta in front of her. "There's a lot you don't know about me," I replied with a smirk. Her laugh was warm and genuine, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than anger or suspicion. As the evening stretched on, our conversation shifted from work to more personal topics. She told me about her family in Portland, her love of hiking, and her dream of someday designing her own sustainable community. By the time the dishes were cleared, the line between colleagues and something more had blurred. "Nate," she said as we stood by the door, her eyes searching mine. "You've been through hell. Are you sure you're ready for this?" I didn't have an answer, so I leaned in and kissed her instead. Things between Jenna and me unfolded naturally after that. She became my confidant, my partner in both business and life. But even as we started building something new, shadows from the past lingered. One afternoon, Carl called with an update. "We've got a problem," he said, his tone grim. "What kind of problem?" I asked, bracing myself. Dylan wasn't working alone. There's a man named Victor who handled some of the logistics for his scams. Maddie's been in contact with him recently. Why would she be talking to him? Carl hesitated. Hard to say, but if Victor knows you've dismantled the LLC and taken control of the funds, he might not be happy about it. I clenched the phone tightly. "Find out everything you can about him." "Already on it," Carl replied. That night, I told Jenna about Carl's discovery. "So there's someone else in the mix?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Apparently," I said. "Carl's looking into it, but I have a bad feeling about this." Jenna reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "Whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone." The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks later. I was driving back from a meeting when the steering wheel suddenly jerked in my hands. I slammed on the brakes, barely managing to pull over before the car skidded to a halt. When I stepped out to inspect the damage, my heart sank. The lug nuts on my front tires had been loosened. I called Carl immediately. "This wasn't an accident," I said. "Someone tampered with my car." "Sounds like Victor's handiwork," Carl replied. "I'll dig deeper, but you need to be careful. If he's willing to go this far, who knows what else he's capable of?" That night, I installed new security cameras around the house and double-checked every lock and window. Jenna offered to stay over, and though I hated putting her at risk, I was grateful for her presence. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling in my mind. Victor wasn't going to stop. If I wanted to protect what I had left, I'd have to take the fight to him. Victor was a shadow, elusive and dangerous. Carl's investigation revealed he was more than just an accomplice to Dylan's schemes. He was the enforcer, the muscle behind the con artist's charming veneer. Victor had made people disappear before, and if I wasn't careful, I could be next. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Carl and I met late one evening at a diner on the outskirts of the city. He slid a file across the table, his face grim. "This is everything we have on Victor," he said. Inside were photographs, addresses, and a list of known associates. Among them, one name stood out: Maddie. She's still in contact with him? I asked, my voice low. Carl nodded. They've exchanged several calls and emails. From what I can gather, she's trying to smooth things over with him, probably to cover her tracks. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Maddie's desperation wasn't just about avoiding jail. She was trying to protect herself from Victor's wrath. What's our move? I asked. Carl smirked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. We set a trap. The plan was simple in theory, but required precision. Using Dylan's journal, Carl and I crafted a message that would catch Victor's attention. It hinted at a stash of money Dylan had hidden away, something Victor would be eager to claim. We sent the message from an anonymous account, baiting Victor to meet at a warehouse Dylan had used in the past. Carl ensured the police were in on it, setting up surveillance and an undercover team to take Victor down. All we needed now was Maddie. I confronted Maddie at her apartment the day before the sting. She opened the door cautiously, her face a mix of relief and apprehension when she saw me. Nate, she said, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She closed the door behind me, wringing her hands nervously. If this is about Victor, I swear it is about Victor, I interrupted. And if you want any chance of walking away from this mess, you're going to help me. Her eyes widened. Help you? How? I laid out the plan, watching as her expression shifted from fear to resignation. If you testify against Victor, the police will protect you, I said. It's your only option, Maddie. Otherwise, he'll turn on you the moment he realizes you're no longer useful. She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. You have no idea what he's capable of, Nate. If I do this, he'll kill me. No, Maddie, I said firmly. If you don't do this, he'll kill you. This is your chance to make things right. For once in your life, do the right thing. After a long silence, she nodded. Okay, I'll do it. The sting went off without a hitch. Victor showed up at the warehouse, expecting to find a stash of cash, only to be met by a team of armed officers. Maddie's testimony was crucial in securing his conviction. She detailed his role in Dylan's schemes and provided evidence that linked him to several unsolved cases. In exchange, the prosecutor offered her a deal. She avoided prison by turning state's evidence, but lost what little credibility she had left. Just when I thought it was over, Jenna discovered something that changed everything. We were cleaning out Dylan's old laptop, searching for files to close the final chapters of his fraudulent empire, when she stumbled upon an encrypted folder. Look at this, she said, turning the screen toward me. The folder was labeled Cayman, and inside were documents that outlined additional fraud schemes Maddie had orchestrated behind Dylan's back. Fake accounts, forged signatures, and embezzled funds all pointed to her complicity in crimes I hadn't even suspected. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. She didn't just betray me, she betrayed Dylan too. Jenna smirked. Guess she wasn't as loyal to him as she claimed. We handed the files over to the authorities, sealing Maddie's fate. She was arrested a week later, her deal with the prosecution voided. The fallout was messy but necessary. With Maddie out of the picture and Victor behind bars, I finally felt a sense of closure. Jenna and I decided it was time for a fresh start. We sold the house and moved to Austin, Texas, where we launched a new branch of the firm. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in years, I felt free.